License, now.
Officer, I'm 7 months pregnant and having discomfort. I need to get to my doctor.
Nice ride. Whose Mercedes is this? Your boss's? Sugar daddy's? 'Cause welfare moms don't drive $60,000 cars.
This is my car. I'm Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance. My ID is right here in my...
Chief Magistrate. Sure you are, sweetheart. And I'm Barack Obama. Step out. You're under arrest for grand theft auto and impersonating a public official.
Lisa Vance had spent the morning presiding over a complex custody hearing, the kind of case that required her to balance compassion with strict adherence to the law. At 35 years old, she had already accumulated a decade of experience on the bench, a career trajectory that spoke to both her exceptional legal mind and her unwavering commitment to justice. She was known throughout the Northern District Court system as someone who never took shortcuts, who read every brief thoroughly, who listened to every argument with genuine attention. Her colleagues respected her. Attorneys who appeared before her, even in defeat, acknowledged her fairness. She had built her reputation one case at a time, one decision at a time, through years of 14-hour days and weekends spent reviewing case law. The black Mercedes sedan she drove was not a gift, not borrowed, not co-signed by anyone. She had walked into the dealership 6 months earlier with a cashier's check, the product of a decade of careful saving and financial discipline that her parents had instilled in her from childhood. The car represented something more than transportation. It was a tangible marker of how far she had come from the subsidized housing complex where she had grown up, where her mother had worked double shifts as a nurse, and her father had driven a city bus for 32 years. Every time Lisa slid behind that leather steering wheel, she thought about the sacrifices her parents had made, the doors they had refused to let close in her face. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as she navigated the mid-afternoon traffic on Route 7, Lisa wasn't thinking about her accomplishments or her journey. Her right hand kept drifting from the steering wheel to rest on the pronounced curve of her belly, a gesture that had become almost reflexive in recent weeks. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required calculation. Getting out of bed demanded strategy. Climbing the courthouse steps left her breathless. And today something felt different. Not wrong exactly, but different enough to send small tendrils of concern threading through her chest. The discomfort had started around noon, a tightness across her abdomen that came and went in irregular waves. Her obstetrician, Dr. Patricia Morrison, had been clear during her last appointment about what constituted a reason to call, what merited concern, what required immediate attention. Lisa had replayed that conversation in her mind 3 times since leaving the courthouse, trying to determine whether what she was experiencing fell into the category of normal pregnancy discomfort or something that needed professional evaluation. By 2:30, she had made the decision to drive directly to Dr. Morrison's office rather than wait until her scheduled appointment the following week. She pressed slightly harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer needle climb from 55 to 65 miles per hour. The speed limit on this stretch of Route 7 was 55. She knew she was breaking the law, but the calculation seemed reasonable. 10 miles over the limit to potentially protect her unborn daughter felt like an acceptable risk. Her daughter. Even now, 7 months into this pregnancy, the reality of impending motherhood could steal her breath. She had picked out a name, Amara, which meant grace. The nursery at home was half finished, painted a soft yellow, because Lisa wanted her daughter to grow up surrounded by light. The flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror so suddenly that Lisa actually flinched, her heart rate spiking in that primal way that happens when authority announces itself. She felt a rush of competing emotions, frustration at the timing, embarrassment at being pulled over, concern about the delay in getting to Dr. Morrison's office, and underneath it all, a flutter of anxiety that she immediately tried to suppress. She had been pulled over exactly 3 times in her life, each incident routine, each interaction professional and brief. She had no reason to expect anything different today. Lisa activated her turn signal and guided the Mercedes onto the shoulder, coming to a complete stop and placing the vehicle in park. Through her side mirror, she watched the patrol car settle in behind her, watched the officer's door open, watched a tall figure emerge and approach her vehicle. She rolled down her window before he reached her, letting the warm afternoon air flood into the air-conditioned interior. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel, a gesture of compliance and transparency that she hoped would expedite this interaction. She needed to get to the doctor. She needed to know that Amara was okay. The officer who appeared at her window carried himself with an aggressive confidence that immediately set Lisa's internal alarms ringing. She had spent 10 years reading people, interpreting body language, assessing credibility. Officer Derek Mason, though she didn't yet know his name, radiated hostility before he even opened his mouth. His hand rested on his service weapon, not gripping it, but maintaining contact, a gesture that spoke volumes about his mindset. His eyes, visible behind standard-issue sunglasses, scanned the interior of her vehicle with undisguised suspicion, as if he expected to find evidence of criminality simply because he had decided to look for it. License and registration. Now, the words came out flat, stripped of any pretense of courtesy. No explanation for the stop. No acknowledgement that she was a human being deserving of basic respect. Just a demand delivered in a tone that made clear he expected immediate obedience. Lisa reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements as she had seen recommended in countless news segments about traffic stop safety. "I'm reaching for my purse now, officer. My license and registration are inside." Her voice remained steady, professional, the same tone she used in her courtroom when addressing attorneys who tested her patience. "I want to explain that I was driving slightly over the speed limit because I'm experiencing some discomfort. I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm trying to get to my obstetrician's office for an examination." Mason's expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Yeah, everyone's got a story," he said, the dismissal so casual it felt like a slap. "Everyone's got an emergency. Everyone's got a reason. Let me see your documents." Lisa extracted her license and registration from her wallet, passing them through the window, with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly. Not from fear, not yet, but from a growing awareness that this interaction was following a script she hadn't anticipated. Mason took the documents without acknowledgement, his eyes dropping to her license, then flicking to the registration, then back to her face. She watched his expression shift, watched something harden in his features as he processed the information. "This address," he said, tapping the license with one thick finger. "Oakmont Hills, that's the expensive neighborhood off Chester Avenue, right?" It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation dressed up in interrogative syntax. "Yes, that's where I live," Lisa replied, keeping her voice neutral even as her internal alarm system began blaring more insistently. She had encountered this particular brand of suspicion before, though never from law enforcement. The assumption that her success, her possessions, her place in the world must be borrowed or stolen or fraudulent because they didn't align with someone's narrow expectations of who she should be and what she should have. Mason straightened up, holding her documents, but making no move to return to his patrol car to run them through the system. "Nice car, too. Mercedes. Must run, what, 50,000, 60? His tone had shifted from dismissive to openly skeptical, each word carrying an unspoken accusation. "So whose car is this really? Your employer's borrowed from a friend, because I've worked this area for 8 years, and people like you don't usually own vehicles like this." The phrase hung in the air between them. People like you and Lisa felt something cold settle in her chest. She had spent her entire professional life dealing with language, with the weight words carried, with the difference between what was said and what was meant. There was no ambiguity here. Mason had looked at her skin, at her gender, at whatever preconceptions he carried, and had decided that her ownership of this vehicle was inherently suspicious. "This is my car," Officer Lisa said, and now her voice carried an edge of steel that her law clerks would have recognized immediately. "I purchased it myself with my own money, and I need to inform you that I am Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance of the Northern District Court. My judicial identification is in my purse, along with my driver's license. If you would like to verify my identity, I can provide that credential. What happened next would be dissected frame by frame in the internal affairs investigation replayed in news broadcasts, cited in the federal civil rights lawsuit that would follow. Officer Derek Mason looked directly at Lisa Vance, a sitting chief magistrate, a woman who had presided over hundreds of cases, including several involving police misconduct, and he laughed. It was a short, barking sound utterly devoid of humor, saturated instead with contempt and disbelief. Chief Magistrate, he repeated, drawing out the syllables in a mocking tone. Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Lady, I've heard some creative excuses in my time, but claiming to be a judge. That's a new low. He stepped back from the window, his hand moving more deliberately toward his weapon. Step out of the vehicle, right now. You're under arrest for speeding, providing false information to a law enforcement officer, and I'm guessing when I run this vehicle, it's going to come back stolen. Lisa's heart was hammering now, adrenaline flooding her system in a way that couldn't be healthy for Amara. Officer, I cannot step out quickly. I'm 7 months pregnant. If you'll just verify my identification. I said step out. Mason's voice had risen to a shout, and now other motorists passing on Route 7 were beginning to slow down, beginning to pay attention to the scene unfolding on the shoulder. Don't make me ask again. Lisa reached for her door handle, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, which wasn't very quick at all. But Mason's patience, if he'd ever possessed any, had evaporated entirely. He grabbed her door and yanked it open, the force of the movement causing it to swing wide and nearly strike her protruding belly. Then his hands were on her upper arm, pulling her from the vehicle with absolutely no consideration for her condition, for her balance, for the life she was carrying. Please. Lisa's voice cracked, genuine fear breaking through her professional composure for the first time. My baby. You're hurting my baby. Her free hand instinctively covered her abdomen, trying to protect Amara from the rough handling, from the stress hormones that must be flooding through both their systems. Mason forced her to turn around, pressing her against the side of the Mercedes. The metal was hot from the afternoon sun, scorching against her palms. She heard the distinctive metallic rattle of handcuffs being removed from his belt. Heard that sound that every person who had ever watched a cop show recognized immediately, the sound of freedom being revoked. And beneath it all, her own ragged breathing, harsh and panicked, in a way she barely recognized. Do you think a police officer has the right to force a pregnant woman to the ground? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The asphalt of Route 7's shoulder was significantly hotter than the ambient air temperature baked by hours of direct sunlight into something that radiated heat like a stovetop burner. Mason's hand on the back of Lisa's neck pushed downward, demanding compliance, demanding submission. On your knees, now. I'm pregnant. Lisa's voice had risen to something close to a scream, desperation overriding every professional instinct she possessed. I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance. Check my credentials. Call the courthouse. But Mason either couldn't hear her through his own certainty or had decided that nothing she said mattered. The pressure on her neck increased until Lisa's knees buckled, until she found herself kneeling on the scorching pavement, her pregnant belly making balance nearly impossible. She could feel the heat through the fabric of her maternity slacks, could feel the small, sharp pieces of gravel embedding themselves in her skin. And all she could think about was Amara, about whether this level of stress and physical trauma could harm her daughter, about whether she would ever forgive herself if something happened because she had driven 10 miles over the speed limit to get to a doctor's appointment. Across the street in the parking lot of a small strip mall, Eleanor Chen had been loading groceries into her Toyota when the flashing lights caught her attention. She was a retired paralegal, someone who had spent 30 years working in various law offices, someone who understood exactly how police interactions were supposed to proceed. What she was watching unfold on Route 7's shoulder looked nothing like proper procedure. It looked, in fact, like something that needed to be documented immediately. Eleanor pulled her iPhone from her purse, tapped the camera app, and began recording. Her hands weren't entirely steady, the image jumping and weaving slightly, but the scene was clear enough. A black woman in professional attire, obviously pregnant, kneeling on the pavement, while a white officer loomed over her with handcuffs. Eleanor's husband, Thomas, emerged from the grocery store carrying their remaining bags, took one look at what his wife was filming, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Call 911, Eleanor said without taking her eyes from her phone screen or shaping her recording. "Tell them an officer is detaining a pregnant woman and it looks like excessive force." Thomas already had his phone out, already dialing. What neither of them knew yet was that the woman they were watching being humiliated and endangered on that highway shoulder wasn't just any pregnant professional. She was someone with the authority to issue warrants to hold law enforcement accountable to change the trajectory of Mason's career with a single judicial order. But in that moment, Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance's power meant nothing. Her credentials meant nothing. Her decade of service to the justice system meant nothing because Officer Derek Mason had looked at her and seen only what his prejudices told him to see. The backup unit arrived within 4 minutes, lights flashing, but no siren. Officer Sarah Kim had been with the department for 6 years, long enough to develop good instincts about when a situation felt wrong. As she pulled up behind Mason's cruiser and saw a pregnant woman in handcuffs kneeling on the pavement in 90-degree heat, every single one of those instincts started screaming. She exited her vehicle, quickly approaching the scene with her hand raised in a gesture that was half greeting, half warning. "Mason, what's the situation?" Kim's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were taking in every detail of the scene, cataloging every element that didn't add up. Mason didn't look up from where he was patting down Lisa's pockets, searching for weapons or contraband or whatever he imagined he might find. "Got a speeder who claims to be a judge," he said, the contempt in his voice making clear exactly how much credibility he gave that claim. "Driving a vehicle that's probably stolen, giving false information to law enforcement. Standard arrest procedure." Kim moved closer, positioning herself where she could see the detainee's face. The woman was crying, not sobbing, but with tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her breath coming in shallow gasps that suggested she was on the edge of a panic attack. Her hands cuffed behind her back were trembling. And her belly, Kim noticed, with a cold rush of horror, was significantly unmistakably pregnant. "You ran her name through the system?" Kim asked, already knowing the answer based on the timeline and Mason's position at the scene. "She's lying," Mason said flatly. "They always lie. I'll run her when we get back to the station. Right now, I'm following protocol for a suspected vehicle theft and false impersonation of a public official." Kim pulled out her radio, making a decision that she knew might create friction with Mason, but that her conscience demanded. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need you to run a name for verification. Lisa Vance, last name Victor Alpha November Charlie Echo. Need immediate confirmation of identity and any flags in the system." The 8 seconds of silence that followed Officer Kim's radio request felt like 8 hours. Traffic continued to flow past on Route 7, drivers slowing down to gawk at the scene, some holding up phones to capture their own footage of what they assumed was just another routine traffic stop. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and Lisa Vance remained on her knees on the scorching asphalt, handcuffs biting into her wrists, her entire body trembling with a combination of physical strain and emotional devastation. She kept her eyes closed, focusing on her breathing, trying to calm herself for Amara's sake, even as her mind raced through the legal implications of what was happening to her. Mason stood behind her, arms crossed, radiating the absolute certainty of someone who believed he had everything figured out. He had already decided how the story would end. He would transport the suspect to the station, run her information, discover whatever outstanding warrants or criminal history existed, and close another case. The fact that she claimed to be a judge only made the eventual arrest more satisfying in his mind. These people, he thought, always had some elaborate story, always claimed to be someone important, always insisted they were being treated unfairly. Officer Kim kept her eyes fixed on her radio, her jaw tight. She had worked enough shifts with Mason to know his patterns, to recognize the signs that he had locked onto a narrative and wouldn't deviate from it regardless of evidence or reason. But she had also worked long enough to develop an instinct for when something was genuinely wrong, and every fiber of her being was currently screaming that this situation had gone catastrophically sideways. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static that made everyone in the vicinity jump slightly. But it was the voice that followed the dispatcher's tone that changed everything. Sergeant Linda Morrison's voice came through with an urgency that was almost never heard on routine radio traffic, each word sharp and clipped and carrying the weight of imminent disaster. Unit 47, be advised. Code Red. The subject in custody is Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance of the Northern District Court. I repeat, Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance. She is a sitting federal judicial officer. You need to release her immediately and request EMS to the scene for evaluation. Badge number on file confirms identity. This is a priority situation. Acknowledge immediately. The silence that followed the transmission was different from the silence that had preceded it. This wasn't the waiting silence of anticipation. This was the stunned silence of realization, the moment when reality crashes through assumption and leaves devastation in its wake. Officer Kim's face had gone completely pale, all the blood draining away as the full magnitude of what Mason had done became crystal clear. She spun toward him, her hand already reaching for the handcuff key on her belt. Mason, get those cuffs off her right now. Kim's voice had risen to something close to a shout, all pretense of professional courtesy abandoned in the face of the catastrophe unfolding before her. Mason's reaction was visible even from a distance. His entire body had gone rigid, his face cycling through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror. The absolute certainty he had possessed 30 seconds earlier had evaporated like water on that scorching asphalt, replaced by the sick realization that he had just committed a career-ending mistake. His hands fumbled for his own handcuff key, his fingers suddenly clumsy and uncooperative. She said, but I thought. The words tumbled out of his mouth without coherence, his brain apparently unable to form complete sentences as it struggled to process what had just happened. Kim physically pushed him aside, kneeling beside Lisa with her key already out. Ma'am, I'm so sorry. We're removing the restraints immediately. Please, can you tell me if you're injured? Her voice had shifted, completely professional concern replacing the neutral cop voice she had been using moments earlier. The handcuffs came off with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Lisa brought her hands forward, slowly wincing as blood flow returned to her wrists. The metal had left deep red indentations in her dark skin marks that would darken to bruises within hours. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control them, and when she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't cooperate. Kim had to physically support her one arm around her back, helping her up with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with how Mason had manhandled her to the ground. Lisa's charcoal gray maternity blazer, which had been immaculate when she left the courthouse that morning, was now covered in dust and grime from the roadside. Her slacks had torn at both knees where she had been forced to kneel, and through the fabric, tears, angry red abrasions were visible, already beginning to seep small amounts of blood. But it was her face that told the real story. Tear tracks had cut lines through the dust on her cheeks. Her eyes, which in her courtroom carried an authority that made seasoned attorneys nervous, were red and swollen and filled with a mixture of rage and humiliation that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Mason took a stumbling step toward her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Your Honor, I didn't know. You have to understand, I didn't know who you were. If you had just... Stop. Lisa's voice cut through his babbling with surgical precision. It wasn't loud. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. This was the voice she used in her courtroom when an attorney had crossed a line, when someone needed to understand that they had made a mistake so fundamental that no excuse would suffice. Don't say another word, officer. Not one more word. But Mason couldn't seem to help himself, the words continuing to spill out in a desperate attempt to somehow undo what had been done. I was just following procedure. You matched a profile. I couldn't have known. You didn't want to know. Lisa's voice was steady now, the initial shock and fear transmuting into something colder and far more dangerous. I told you I was a magistrate. I told you my credentials were in my vehicle. I told you I was pregnant and needed medical attention. You didn't care about any of that because you had already decided who I was based on what you saw when you looked at me. You saw my skin color. You saw a woman. You saw someone you assumed couldn't possibly own that car, couldn't possibly hold that position, couldn't possibly deserve basic human dignity. Officer Kim had her radio out again, her voice professionally neutral but carrying an undertone of urgency. Dispatch Unit 47, requesting immediate ambulance response to our location on Route 7 mile marker 42. We have a pregnant female 7 months gestation who has been subjected to physical restraint and needs medical evaluation. Priority response requested. Lisa's hand had returned to her belly, pressing gently, as if she could somehow reassure Amara through the wall of skin and muscle and fluid that separated them. She could feel movement, thank God, those familiar flutters and kicks that had become so constant in recent weeks. But there was also a tightness across her abdomen that hadn't been there before, a tension that made her breath catch. I need badge numbers from everyone on scene, Lisa said, her courtroom voice fully engaged now, despite the circumstances. Full names, badge numbers, and body camera confirmation. Officer Kim, I appreciate your assistance, but you were also present while I was detained and did not intervene immediately. I'll need your information as well. Kim nodded, no argument, no defensiveness. She understood exactly how this would proceed. Of course, Your Honor. I'm Officer Sarah Kim, badge number 2847. My body camera has been recording since I arrived on scene. Mason had gone completely silent now, standing several feet away, with his arms hanging limply at his sides. His face had settled into a grayish pallor, the look of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. He had been on the force for 8 years. He had a pension coming. He had a reputation, colleagues who respected him, a trajectory that he had assumed would lead to detective rank within another few years. And in the span of 35 minutes, he had destroyed all of it because he couldn't see past his own prejudices long enough to verify the identity of the woman he was arresting. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after Kim's call, pulling onto the shoulder with lights flashing, but no siren. 2 paramedics emerged, a man and a woman, both moving with the efficient urgency of people who understood that pregnancy plus stress plus physical trauma equaled potential catastrophe. The female paramedic, whose name tag identified her as J. Rodriguez, approached Lisa with a gentle smile that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt almost absurd given the circumstances. Ma'am, I'm Jennifer Rodriguez, paramedic. Can you tell me what happened and what you're feeling right now? She was already pulling out equipment, a blood pressure cuff, a fetal Doppler, an oximeter for Lisa's finger. Lisa recounted the essential facts in the same concise manner she would use when dictating an opinion from the bench. I was pulled over for speeding. Officer Mason arrested me and placed me in handcuffs. I was forced to kneel on the pavement for approximately 6 minutes while 7 months pregnant. I'm experiencing abdominal tightness, and I need someone to verify that my baby is okay. Rodriguez's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of anger or disgust, or both quickly suppressed behind professional neutrality. Okay, let's get you checked out. I'm going to take your vitals first, and then we'll use the Doppler to check on the baby's heartbeat. Can you sit down in the back of the ambulance? Lisa allowed herself to be guided to the ambulance each step, sending sharp pains through her abraded knees. Kim stayed close, one hand hovering near Lisa's elbow in case she stumbled. Mason remained where he was, a statue of misery and dawning comprehension. Across the street, Eleanor Chen was still recording, her phone battery running low, but her determination unwavering. She had captured everything from the initial detention to the radio call that changed everything to this moment of Lisa being treated by paramedics for injuries that should never have occurred. The blood pressure cuff inflated around Lisa's upper arm tight enough to be uncomfortable. Rodriguez watched the reading carefully, her expression neutral, but her eyes conveying concern. BP is elevated 150 over 95. That's concerning, but not immediately dangerous. How are you feeling? Any dizziness, visual disturbances, severe headache? No, none of that, Lisa said. Just a tightness in my abdomen and my hands are still shaking. Rodriguez nodded, pulling out the fetal Doppler. I'm going to need you to lift your shirt so I can check the baby's heartbeat. This gel is going to be cold, I apologize. She squeezed a clear gel onto Lisa's exposed belly and placed the Doppler against her skin, moving it slowly, searching for that distinctive rapid patter that would indicate fetal well-being. The sound when it came through the Doppler's small speaker was the most beautiful thing Lisa had heard in her entire life. Fast and strong and steady, Amar's heartbeat filled the space inside the ambulance. 150 beats per minute. Rodriguez announced well within normal range. The baby was stressed. The elevated heart rate made that clear, but she was alive and fighting and apparently resilient enough to withstand what her mother had just endured. Lisa's own tears came then, not the panicked crying from earlier, but something deeper, a release of tension so profound it left her gasping. Her hands covered her face and her shoulders shook with sobs that were equal parts relief and residual fear and burning rage at what had been done to her daughter, to the basic dignity they both deserved. Kim stood just outside the ambulance, maintaining a professional distance, but close enough to hear everything. She had her notebook out and was writing, steadily documenting every detail, because she knew this incident report would be scrutinized by internal affairs, by the department's legal counsel, by the media, by federal investigators. Her career might survive this, she thought, if she documented everything meticulously and honestly. Mason's career was already over. They both knew that, but Kim still had a chance if she handled this exactly right. Rodriguez completed her examination, checking Lisa's abraded knees, examining the deep indentations on her wrists, taking note of the trembling that hadn't subsided. Ma'am, I need to strongly recommend that you allow us to transport you to County General for a complete evaluation. Your blood pressure is elevated, you've experienced significant physical and emotional trauma, and you're in your third trimester. Your OB should examine you as soon as possible. Lisa shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm going to my obstetrician's office. That's where I was headed before I was pulled over. Dr. Patricia Morrison is expecting me. She's familiar with my pregnancy history, and she's the one who should evaluate me. Rodriguez looked like she wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. All right, but you should not drive yourself. Is there someone that we can call to take you? My husband, Lisa said, her voice still unsteady. I'll call my husband. He can be here in 15 minutes. Mason had finally moved from his frozen position, approaching the ambulance, with the tentative steps of someone approaching a dangerous animal. His face had moved past pale into something that looked almost green. Your Honor, I need you to understand that I didn't mean for any of this. He trailed off, apparently unable to find words adequate to the situation. Lisa looked at him with an expression that combined contempt and something that might have been pity if it had contained any warmth. Officer Mason, you need to understand something very clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. You chose to ignore my identification. You chose to disbelieve my credentials. You chose to physically restrain a visibly pregnant woman. You chose to humiliate me on the side of a highway because you couldn't conceive of a world where someone who looks like me could hold the position I hold. Don't insult both of us by pretending this was an accident. She turned to Kim. I want copies of all dashboard camera footage, Yoli, body camera footage, and your incident reports. I want them delivered to my chambers by end of business tomorrow. And I want the name and contact information for your department's internal affairs division and the citizen complaint process. Do you understand? Kim nodded, her face grim. Yes, Your Honor. I'll make sure everything is documented and provided to you as requested. Lisa pulled out her phone, hands still trembling slightly, and dialed her husband. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice warm and relaxed, completely unaware that his wife's world had just been turned inside out. Hey, babe, did your appointment go okay? Marcus, Lisa said, and her voice cracked on his name. I need you to come get me. I'm on Route 7 at mile marker 42. Something happened. I'm okay. The baby's okay, but I need you to come get me right now. The internal affairs investigation that followed moved with unusual speed, propelled by the fact that the victim wasn't just any citizen, but a sitting chief magistrate whose credibility was beyond question. Captain James Richardson, a 23-year veteran who had conducted hundreds of internal investigations, opened Mason's personnel file expecting to find a relatively clean record with perhaps one or two minor complaints. What he found instead made his stomach turn. 9 citizen complaints over 8 years. 9 separate incidents, each involving a woman of color, each describing interactions that range from unnecessary aggression to outright harassment. Miss Keisha Williams had complained 2 years earlier that Mason had pulled her over for a broken taillight and spent 20 minutes questioning how she could afford the Lexus she was driving. 34-year-old attorney Jasmine Porter had filed a formal complaint after Mason detained her outside her own law office, refusing to believe she worked there despite her building key card and business card. 22-year-old nursing student Maria Santos had reported that Mason had searched her vehicle for drugs based on nothing more than his stated belief that young Hispanic women in that neighborhood were usually involved in trafficking. The pattern was unmistakable, undeniable, and deeply damning. Each complaint had been investigated, Richardson discovered with mounting horror, but investigated in the most cursory manner possible. Interviewed subjects had been deemed uncooperative or unable to provide sufficient evidence. Mason's word had been taken over theirs in every single case. He had received written reprimands twice, been sent to a 4-hour diversity training seminar once, and otherwise faced no meaningful consequences for behavior that clearly violated both department policy and constitutional law. Richardson's report, filed 18 days after the incident with Chief Magistrate Vance, pulled no punches. Officer Mason has demonstrated a consistent pattern of racially motivated stops and searches. His actions on Route 7 represent not an isolated incident, but the inevitable culmination of years of biased policing that this department failed to adequately address. Recommend immediate termination and referral to the State Police Certification Board for permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials. The footage, meanwhile, had taken on a life of its own. Eleanor Chen's iPhone video hit social media within hours of the incident, uploaded by her paralegal friend, who understood exactly how explosive the content would be. The dash cam footage from Mason's cruiser, obtained through a public records request filed by the ACLU, provided the other angle. Together, they painted a picture so clear, so damning, that even the police union's lawyer advised Mason not to fight the termination. The hashtag #PregnantJudge began trending on Twitter within 48 hours, eventually accumulating over 3 million tweets. News outlets from CNN to local television stations ran segments featuring the footage, legal experts weighing in on the constitutional violations of medical professionals, expressing horror at the danger posed to both Lisa and her unborn child. The story had everything that makes content go viral in the social media age: clear video evidence, and sympathetic victim, an obvious villain, and stakes that anyone could understand. Mason was fired on a Wednesday morning, 21 days after he had pulled over Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance. He cleaned out his locker in silence, surrounded by former colleagues who wouldn't make eye contact. His police certification was permanently revoked by the state board 3 weeks later, ensuring he would never work in law enforcement anywhere in the country again. His wife filed for divorce 6 weeks after the incident, unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the man revealed in that dash cam footage. The federal civil rights lawsuit that Lisa's attorneys filed was textbook in its construction. Violation of Fourth Amendment rights through unlawful seizure. Violation of 14th Amendment rights through discriminatory enforcement. Battery. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. The evidence was so overwhelming that the city's insurance company pushed hard for settlement, terrified of what a jury might award if the case went to trial. But Lisa refused to settle quietly. She wanted a trial. She wanted a jury to see that footage. She wanted a public accounting of what had been done to her and why it had been allowed to happen. Her legal team, led by noted civil rights attorney Marcus Chen, who had won similar cases across the country, structured the case to tell the story not just of one traffic stop, but of systemic failure stretching back years. The trial lasted 8 days. The jury, 7 women and 5 men of various racial backgrounds, watched the dash cam footage 4 separate times. They heard testimony from Eleanor Chen, who described watching a pregnant woman being forced to kneel on scorching pavement. They heard from the paramedic who had evaluated Lisa at the scene and documented her elevated blood pressure and visible injuries. They heard from Dr. Morrison, Lisa's obstetrician, who testified about the potential risks to both mother and fetus from the kind of stress and physical trauma Lisa had endured. Mason himself took the stand, a decision his attorney had advised against, but that Mason insisted upon. He tried to explain his actions, tried to make the jury understand that he had been following his training, that he had genuinely believed Lisa was lying about her identity. Under cross-examination by Chen, his explanations crumbled. Why hadn't he run her license before arresting her? Why had he refused to look at her judicial credentials? Why had he forced a visibly pregnant woman to kneel on hot pavement? His answers became increasingly incoherent, his discomfort obvious. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. When they returned, the forewoman, a 58-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy Washington, read the verdict with a steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Liable on all counts, compensatory damages $400,000, punitive damages $800,000, total award $1.2 million. Lisa sat perfectly still as the verdict was read, Marcus's hand gripping hers tightly. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the weight of vindication settle over her. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed cameras, flashing microphones extended. Lisa read a prepared statement, her voice steady and clear. This verdict sends a message that no one, regardless of their position or authority, is exempt from accountability when they violate someone's constitutional rights. But more importantly, it sends a message to every woman of color who has been stopped, searched, detained, or humiliated by law enforcement officers who see their skin color before they see their humanity. You are not crazy. You are not oversensitive. What happened to you was wrong, and there are legal remedies available. 3 months later, Lisa gave birth to Amara Grace Vance, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, healthy and perfect. Lisa held her daughter in the hospital room, Marcus at her side, and thought about how close she had come to losing this moment. The elevated blood pressure from the incident had persisted through the remainder of her pregnancy, requiring monitoring and medication. The psychological trauma had been worse. She had developed anxiety around driving panic attacks when she saw police vehicles, nightmares where she relived those moments on Route 7 over and over. But Amara was here, breathing and warm and alive. And Lisa had made a decision about what to do with the settlement money. She established the Mothers Against Police Brutality Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal representation of women who experience police misconduct, particularly women of color and pregnant women. Within its first year, the fund had helped 43 women file complaints and lawsuits against officers who had violated their rights. Mason, meanwhile, had lost everything: his career, his marriage, his reputation, his pension forfeited as part of the termination agreement. He had moved to another state working as a private security guard at a shopping mall, earning a fraction of his police salary. He would spend the rest of his life defined by those 35 minutes en Route 7, by the decision to let his prejudices override his training, by the moment he looked at Chief Magistrate Lisa Vance and saw only what his bias told him to see. Justice had been served, but as Lisa would tell reporters in interviews about the case, justice doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't undo the fear she felt kneeling on that pavement, wondering if her daughter would survive. It doesn't eliminate the anxiety that still grips her when she sees flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Justice is accountability. Justice is consequences. But healing, Lisa learned, is something else entirely. Something that takes much longer and requires far more than a jury verdict and a settlement check. Have you witnessed similar incidents of police misconduct in your community? Share this story to help others learn how to protect their rights. Follow for more cases that expose injustice and demand accountability.